Okay, here we are on this one. Understanding the meaning and essence of the Constitution. You'll find that the lessons we're teaching come from the book, The 5,000-Year Leap. But when you read the chapter, you won't read much of what I've said because I've gone way beyond what we did in that research. Way beyond it. But the 19th principle reads, only limited and carefully defined powers should be delegated to government, all others being retained in the people. If we followed those principles, the sun would rise on America again. The Liberty Bell, I took the picture myself, through the window, it was after hours. There are 3 words we need to know when we study American heritage. If we do not understand these 3 words, we cannot understand our history. We cannot understand how to conduct our government. The 3 words are very basic. What is the meaning of federal? We hear it every day. It's as abused as the word conservative. Nobody knows what federal means, and yet we use it in our vocabulary, thinking that we do. I mean, we all know what federal means, don't we? Why, it's the federal government. They're supreme. The Supreme Court is part of that. They tell us what the Constitution is. Isn't that the federal? Sure. And we have no say in the states. That's what they tell us. We're going to have to learn what enumeration means. And the 3rd word is separation. These 3 words are the keys to understanding the Constitution. We'll start with federal. Now, rarely do I have a picture I took myself. I took that one myself. I was there at Independence Hall as we installed the printing press just around the corner. The printing press that prints the Constitution and the Declaration, if they would only read it. Being printed by the federal government in Ben Franklin's grandson's print shop. Federal. If we're going to understand the document, we need to understand it in terms of the way the words were used in the early days. And so I frequently go back to the dictionaries of the time period. If I want to know what a word means in 1774, do I go to an 1828 dictionary? No. No, the word may have changed. It may not have changed, but we must confirm its meaning when it was used. Okay, the words of the Constitution are quite well represented by this man who was there. He was one of the interactors at that time period. In 1828, he tells how the word federal was used. Federal. Pertaining to a contract between nations. Last night's lesson we tried to teach that. How many new nations were born? 13. And when they called it the federal government, it was a contract between 13 nations. You see, this is so clear. This is called evidence. As a federal government, such as that of the United States. So those 13 nations created a federal government, and by the way, the word federation and confederation were synonymous in that day, and so they had a confederation of 13 nations, and they called it the United States. That is the correct explanation. Federate. United by compact, as sovereignties, states, or nations joined in a confederacy. Wow. This is the story of America. We were 13 nations joined by compact, and we could just as well have been called a confederacy as a federation. A federation, in the definition, is a confederacy. Okay, this is new language to most people in how to apply it to our early founding. So the federal government, an agency, this is my definition. After my studies, I put it into a definition. An agency created by a contract between the states. The contract delegates a few specific powers to the agency. Under the contract, agents are employed and vested with power to perform the duties defined in the contract. That's my definition. You try it. Do your studies and then try defining, boil it down, see if you can put it into concise terms. In the Federalist Papers, we'll learn some things that will help us. Powers delegated to the federal government by the Constitution. Defined. Now we're talking here about the federal government, the meaning of the word federal. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government aren't they numerous and indefinite? Isn't that what it's supposed to say there? Isn't it supposed to say the implied powers mean you can do anything you want? No. No, this is considered to be a very good definition of federal government, and their powers are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects, as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. Why is taxation the least powerful part of it? Because they won't need very much money to carry out the programs that they've been delegated. What are their programs? War, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. They won't need much money to do that because they will be not warmongers, but they will stay home and mind their own business and only do defensive war if someone comes in aggressively to attack our country. That's why they won't need much money. This is the original program of the federal government, literally federal government. Few and defined. Powers are delegated, not ceded. Well, what else can we learn from this one? The federal and governments are in fact agents and trustees of the people, constituted with different powers and designed for different purposes. Okay, there are two levels of government. We have agents and trustees at both levels, and they're hired by the people to carry out enumerated, specific, defined powers. They both have different purposes. The foist and delete violations. The original 13th Amendment was replaced in 1865. Now, we're not going to go into detail. Let's throw this out to tantalize your minds. What's he talking about? I never heard that before. In 1865, they dumped the original 13th and put in a new one. You can Google that and see what the story is. The 14th Amendment, December the 6th, 1865, made the federal government superior to the states. That date's bugging me right now. I thought it was 1868. I wonder if I've got an error on the screen or I'm referring to a different part of the process. Maybe that's when they launched it. I don't know. Anyway, it was in that early period. It made the federal government superior to the states, provided for murdering millions of babies. Now, which case is that they used the 14th Amendment? Roe versus Wade in 1973. Oh, under the 14th Amendment, we can do such and such. And they launched the murdering of millions of babies. The 16th Amendment was also fraudulently passed, foisted upon us, in 1913. It provided for illegal plunder, chaos, and abuse. And which amendment's that? Provides for income tax. Okay? These are three. But the one I want to make mention of specifically today, and we'll go into a little more detail, and this will come as a surprise to most of you. The 17th Amendment, April the 8th, 1913, obliterated federalism. Let's go back and talk about the 17th Amendment. This is a quotation from the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, the 19th of January, 1788. They're in convention trying to decide, shall we accept or shall we not accept this proposed plan called the Constitution. This is where the life was given to the document. It was in the ratifying debates where they determined what it meant. It wasn't the men that wrote it, it was the men that were ratifying. What did they think it meant? That was what was important. And then when they finally voted yes or no, that's called ratifying the Constitution. The state governments are essential parts of the system. The senators represent the sovereignty of the states. They are in the quality of ambassadors of the states. But suppose that they were to be chosen by the people at large. Whom in that case would they represent? Not the legislatures of the states, but the people. This would totally obliterate the federal features of the Constitution. What would become of the state governments, and on whom would devolve the duty of defending them against the encroachments of the federal government? That was in 1788 that they were debating in the Constitution the role of the Senate. The senators, you remember, were selected by the state legislature. And he's explaining why that was so important. Here in another debate, this is the North Carolina Ratifying Convention, July the 25th, 1788. The people will be represented in one house of Congress, the state legislatures in the other. The state legislatures would be represented in the Senate. Now what do we have today? We have two houses of representatives. We don't have anyone representing the states. No one. And what was the warning? If no one represents the states, what would become of the state governments, and on whom would devolve the duty of defending them against the encroachment of the federal government? There is no one defending the states against the encroachment of the federal government today. We have two houses of representatives. Article 1, Section 3, page 2 in your little booklet. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof. Now the brackets mean that was taken out by the 17th Amendment. Chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Okay, originally the legislature chose the senators. Article 5 reads, no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Article 5 is the portion of the Constitution which describes the amending process. And they make one clarification, that you can't amend the Constitution with that process. You will follow the process with this exception. No state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. And so then they took the proposed amendment to the states. Did they get the consent of every state? No, absolutely not. And guess who one of the most outspoken states was that denounced the 17th Amendment and would not give their consent? You guessed. Yes, Utah. I think there were 3 total. One of them was Rhode Island, one was Utah, one of the others. They would not accept. If they do not give their consent, the 17th Amendment cannot be ratified, cannot be passed. Well, it was another one foisted upon the country. They ignored that and passed it anyway. And now we have no representation from the state of Utah. Amendment 17. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. This is the second House of Representatives being formed. 12 states did not give their consent. 3 of them specifically voted against it. Utah specifically voted against the 17th. Article 5, page 15. No state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Oh, people argue today. The official literature says, oh, the states got representatives. They're the senators. They're elected by the people. No, that's not the state. The people are not the state. If that were the case, why would they use the state and the people in the 10th Amendment in the same line? The state and the people are 2 different bodies, and the state is deprived because they took it away and gave it to the people. Now let's see if we can read this with better understanding. The state governments are essential parts of the system. The senators represent the sovereignty of the states. They are in the quality of ambassadors of the states. But suppose that they were to be chosen by the people at large. Whom in that case would they represent? Not the legislatures of the states, but the people. This would totally obliterate the federal features of the Constitution. What would become of the state governments, and on whom would devolve the duty of defending them against the encroachment of the federal government? You got it now, don't you? That's a meaningful statement spoken in 1788 by one of our founding fathers. The people will be represented in one house of Congress, the state legislatures in the other. Following the fraudulent 17th Amendment, who did the senators represent? We submit for your consideration. That's my polite way of saying I'm going to tell you the truth whether you like it or not. We submit for your consideration the 17th Amendment was the final nail in the coffin to totally obliterate the federal features of the Constitution. The final nail in the coffin. Say, I have some of my peers who claim to be students that say, It was the 17th Amendment where the great pivotal point was, and that's where they began to violate the Constitution. You know, we got these people that say, it was Franklin Roosevelt, or it was, Woodrow Wilson, or it was the case of the Interstate Commerce Clause 70 years ago, or it was the General Welfare case, the Butler case. These are the places where the pivotal moment took place and the Constitution was violated. About that time, I think, maybe they ought to go back a little earlier. Maybe it was when our rights were violated. Maybe it was when Eve partook of the forbidden fruit. Yeah. See, we've always had two contending forces, and nothing's changed. News release, State of Wyoming, a resolution in the year 2010. Now, resolutions don't hold any weight. All they are is the opinion of the legislature. I don't think they even passed it when I got this. They were just debating it. I was in Montana, where I probably heard of this just a week or two ago, 3 weeks ago. House Joint Resolution number H, so forth, repeal of the 17th Amendment. There is a state debating in the state legislature the repeal of the 17th Amendment. They're that interested in removing this corrupt piece of, what is it? Give it a descriptive term. Foistering. Thank you. This corrupt piece of foistering. The Republic of Republics, excellent reading, not easy, it'll take you a while to wade through it, has this illustration that I felt was valuable. Done in 1878, he's describing by artwork the federal and the state governments. He says, draw a line from point A to point B, and let this line represent the domain on which sovereignty is to act. Now he says, above that put point C. Let this represent the federal servants. Now those federal servants have a responsibility. We have delegated to them specific and enumerated powers, and they are to serve the people in this domain. Now he says, put up there a point D. Let this represent the state servants. They have a responsibility. They're going to serve the people in the same domain. They have a different set of responsibilities. And so we have them serving the people. He says, consider this like employees on a ranch or a farm. Some of the employees, part C, have a duty to perform, and the other employees, part D, have a different duty to perform in serving the people. These are agents serving the people. However, above all that, he says, put point E, because the people direct and control the agents. Now, that was an illustration in 1878. I thought, that's pretty good. We could still use that in political science class today. In Massachusetts State Constitution, we're talking about the 1878, the earlier version. This comes from a book written in 1878. This is out of the Sage book. All power residing originally in the people and being derived from them, the several magistrates and officers of government vested with authority, whether legislative, executive, or judicial, are their substitutes and agents, and are at all times accountable to them. And so these points, we have point C and point D. These are the substitutes and agents of the people, and are accountable to the people at all times. They are vested with authority, and next Friday night we'll bring actual vest, and we'll actually put them on. I want to get you in a vest. Yes, an Ace Hardware vest. Some of you folks here, we'll actually invite you to put a vest on, and we'll try to make this point really strong. This is again from the 1878 book. He says, let's diagram it like this. The people hold the power. All power is in the people. And the people, through their delegation of power to the states, created the Constitution. The Constitution created the federal government. And the federal government then is given the authority to direct and control and rule with the people in control. He tried to make that very clear in this illustration. Each Republican citizen has two capacities. We see here that the people govern and the people are governed. The ultimate authority resides in the people alone. In our American Republican form of government, people express their ultimate authority through the state governments which the people themselves organized. This is called Republican government. These are my definitions. These are my summaries that I wrote. This power of the people, expressed through their state governments, became known as state sovereignty. As in America, all power resides in the people, and the people exercise their power through their individual state governments, and as absolute power cannot be divided, then it is through the individual states that the sovereign powers are exercised. This is the Republican form of government that evolved in America between 1607 and 1790. The federal government was to represent the states and not the people. Here's another line that Sage put into his book. Remember, this is 1878. All of this little section coming from that book. The people as sovereign communities. I've used the zip code designators for the communities up here. They created the Constitution. The Constitution created the government, what we would call the federal government, and then the people voluntarily submitted themselves to this program which they created. However, that changed. That was before the war between the states. This diagram he makes clear was before the war between the states. Social issues belong to states. See, this bothers some people. But what if Massachusetts passes a law allowing same-sex marriage? And then Utah will be compelled to accept that because it's a state law. We've got to have federal control over that. Isn't that what we say? We've got to have more federal regulation to keep abuses from things like same-sex marriage. That's the example they like to give. Prayer in school, abortion, same-sex marriage, sodomy, these are social issues. In the original program, they belong to the states. You deal with it at the state level. But what if the government observes a state doing something which it does not approve? Isn't this a serious problem? I've got to write my congressman because Massachusetts is doing some bad things. And California is intolerable. I mean, we've got to force California to accept the textbooks that Texas authorizes. Yeah? Did you hear about that lately? Texas textbooks are not going to be popular in California. U.S. history books, because Texas is not telling the story the way California wants it told. Well, we better have a federal regulation of textbooks. Yeah? Don't let me pull you into that one. Like passing a law against sodomy, praying in public school, restricting abortions, passing a law to allow same-sex marriage, manufacturing firearms. Why did they put that one up there? Shouldn't we have federal control of all this so that there's goodness and right being done? I mean, the states are too ignorant to rule themselves, right? How come Utah just passed a law defying the Federal Firearms Bureau? Utah did that. The state legislature, they passed a law. It's called the Freedom and Firearms Act. And it says in that act that we can manufacture firearms in Utah as long as we keep them here and we put stamp made in Utah on them. That just happened. What is our state legislature trying to say? They're trying to say we have sovereignty, yeah, and we thumb our noses at you. Now, all of this will be a big contest. It will be some kind of a conflagration between entities, states versus federal. And it's going on now, and it's getting bigger, and it will come to some kind of a climax. How do we know which powers belong to which branch of government? Now that we finished the word federal. Now we're going to handle the next word, enumeration. This is how we determine which powers belong to which branch. Enumeration of powers. In the 1878 book, Sage draws this illustration. This is a cabinet with a whole bunch of little, what he calls pigeonholes. A repository of powers prepared in written form and pigeonholed. So he says, get your smartest people, have them write down all of the powers that the people possess, individual pieces of paper, every power on a separate piece of paper. And he says, make this big cabinet and poke these in these holes, and then decide what to do with them. Oh, well, if we're going to have government, we need to delegate some powers. That's what government is. So we delegate 70 powers to the state government. Actually, I made those numbers up. 70 powers to the state government. So we see 70 of those spaces are empty. The state handles them. 20 powers to the federal government. That's actually quite accurate. If you count the powers in the Constitution, 20 is a pretty good number, depending on how you break them out. And the rest are retained by the people. And so down here you see boxes well, I can't even read the numbers, but you see these little boxes. These are still full of the powers that are retained by the people. That's a nice illustration. Now, the purpose of the Constitution is to limit the power of the central government. That's why they wrote the contract. If they wanted a general powers, all the powers to the federal government, they would have just written it differently. They would have just written down, you got all the power, we retain nothing, do what you think is best for us. Is that what the Constitution's for? No. Limit the power of the central government. Sometimes I am accused of interpreting the Constitution. They say, oh, that's just your interpretation. Yeah, the Supreme Court, they're the ones that I look to. They're the guys that know what's going on. No, I'm going to have you interpret it, okay? This audience right here. You ready? Think you can handle this assignment? What's the first word of the Constitution? Now, not the preamble and not the Article 1 part. The first word, yeah, right there. See it? Oh, my, oh, my. Those of you that were here in the meeting last night, no pets. No pets. In the contract. There was a legitimate contract. No pets allowed. Okay, what's the meaning of the word all when the liberals talk about it? What's the meaning when the conservatives talk about it? Oh, does it mean 67%? Well, that's just your interpretation. I'd say it means 32%. That's if you're Bernie Sanders from Vermont. Or if you're Senator Orrin Hatch, it means 67%. Or if you're Senator Robert Bennett, it means 63%. Or if you're... Oh, do you get the idea? What does all mean? Oh, really? All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. And the Senate would have been appointed by the state legislatures to protect the rights of the states. Heads up! All legislative powers are vested, not ceded. Now we go through the beginning of each article where powers are vested, and they read, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested. The Congress shall, and it enumerates the powers. The law that governs those who govern. That's what this Constitution is. Article 2, the executive power shall be vested in a president. And then the president's powers are enumerated. The law that governs those who govern. It doesn't start with all this time. The judicial power shall be vested in courts, with the exceptions clause. That beautiful exceptions clause. In the first place, it is to be remembered that the general government is not to be charged with the whole power of making and administering laws. Its jurisdiction is limited to certain enumerated objects which concern all the members of the Republic. This is the wise counsel from the Federalist Papers. So the federal government is not supposed to be making laws on every subject. It's supposed to be making laws on those specific enumerated objects that were given to it. War, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce are the categories in which they are to be making laws. The 10th Amendment was evolved from the work of the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were a group that believed the Constitution was not clear enough and would be abused, and there would be a powerful central government. And if David doesn't come pretty soon, we will probably have mutiny in here. I got faith. David will be back. Maryland put this in as a suggested 10th Amendment. Now, 10th wasn't, they didn't know what number it would be, but it became the 10th Amendment. Maryland's proposal for this protection against the federal government was, we should put in an amendment that says, Congress shall exercise no power but what is expressly delegated by this Constitution. Now, that's pretty clear, isn't it? Yes, well, Massachusetts said, let's do it this way. All powers not expressly delegated by the aforesaid Constitution are reserved by the several states to be by them exercised. Well, South Carolina said it this way. The states retain every power not expressly relinquished by them and vested in the general government of the Union. Now we can go on. There are more states that had their submissions as they came up with their ideas. This is a modern news flash. Modern meaning it was March the 30th, 2009. This was the beginning, as I see it, of the 10th Amendment movement across the country today. Now, you heard of that, have you? The 10th Amendment movement. It's big news. It's top news. It's important what's happening. This began in Oklahoma in March of 2009, taking on the feds. With Oklahoma leading the way, the juggernaut known as the 10th Amendment movement is gaining steam across the nation. Here on March the 1st, 2010, we have a magazine that I hold in high respect. The New American puts this on the front cover, the boxing gloves. What kind of a contest is going to go on now between the states versus the federal? In this case, regarding the nullification movement, same thing, 10th Amendment movement. Here is the 10th Amendment that finally evolved from those submitted suggestions. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. This wonderful 10th Amendment. That's an exciting piece of literature. This is what's causing all the stir in state legislatures as they say, I believe our sovereignty was abused. Thomas Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State, he wrote to President George Washington an opinion against the constitutionality of the National Bank, 15th of February, 1791. The 10th Amendment is the foundation of the Constitution. Now, 30 years ago, when I first sat in that little old room there in Lehi, Utah, and I heard the old professor, that old man, 65 years old, I heard him giving this lesson, and he said the 10th Amendment is the most violated clause in the entire document. What's he talking about? I had no idea. I just sat there, I'm just like a bump on a log. I'd never even heard of the 10th Amendment. I didn't know there were 10. I'm serious. I had no knowledge of a republic and the principles of the Constitution. Never read the document in my life. It was never even suggested I read it. I had graduated from leading universities and never read the Constitution. Oh, that wasn't required in history class or any other class. It isn't even required when you take constitutional law at the law school. They don't study the Constitution. Do you know that? They don't study the Constitution. All they study is the court cases, and they call it constitutional law. I sat by a constitutional law scholar. He was a lawyer in an airplane, and we were discussing this. And he said to me, my professor told me not to read the Constitution. It was too confusing. Yeah, that's where the law schools are today. The 10th Amendment is the foundation of the Constitution. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specifically drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. Oh, hang on, this is the tough one. There are individuals, I've done you a favor here, I condensed the first paragraph into one sentence. It's accurate. There are individuals who want to apply federal tax dollars. That's one paragraph put down into one sentence. There are individuals who want to apply federal tax dollars to the great purposes of the public education, roads, rivers, canals, and other such objects of the public improvement as it may be thought proper to add to the constitutional enumeration of federal powers. I suppose an amendment to the Constitution by consent of the states necessary, because the objects now recommended are not among those enumerated in the Constitution, and to which it permits the public monies to be applied. You cannot spend money on education, roads, rivers, canals, and other public improvements without an amendment to the Constitution. Did they make one? Is there an amendment that allows you to spend money on education, canals, and so forth? No, they never amended it. They just stole the power. They usurped it. Starting in, subtract the number 1789 from 2010, and that's when they started. Warning, this man was a great hero of American history. If those who administer the general government be permitted to transgress the limits fixed by the compact, by a total disregard to the special delegations of power therein contained, annihilation of the state governments, and the erection upon their ruins of a general consolidated government, will be the inevitable consequence. And that's exactly what happened. Well, Stephen Breyer, living constitutionalist, Antoine Scalia, originalist. Most people think the battle is conservatives versus liberals, when it is actually originalist versus living constitutionalist. Now the last word. David, we're going to finish this lesson before he shows up. Do you want to stand and stretch? Are you still okay? Or where are we on it? You're okay. Separation. Separation of powers. That's what we're talking about. These are the three words that we need to understand original intent. In the book, The Federalist Papers, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or of many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Now, if we give a government agency the authority to make the law, interpret the law, and execute the law, that is the very definition of tyranny. Are there any government agencies that have that responsibility? There are a big long list of agencies that do that. I heard a few of them muttered out there: BLM, Forest Service, IRS, and others. Okay? This is the definition of tyranny. That's why we wanted separation of powers, so that we didn't have this abuse taking place. So we're back here to this silhouette of the hand, a voluntary compact between free, independent, and sovereign states. In 1789, the sovereign states pointed the way. They created the Constitution. They divided the powers, and they called it the United States of America. And in that day, they used the word "our" because it was not a singular proper noun. It was distinct separate entities who had confederated. Now the Bill of Rights. We can't end this lesson without saying something about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was passed shortly after the Constitution was ratified, and it was the reason, or the resulting from the Anti-Federalists. They were the ones that were given credit for seeing the Bill of Rights came into the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is better called the Declaration of Prohibitions, because the rights are given by God. Man doesn't give rights. All we do is try to protect rights. The rights to life, liberty, and property are the three heroic things we're supposed to have government protect. And there is a statement, I give it once in Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama. It's the quotation from the Alabama State Constitution. The sole object and only legitimate end of government is the protection of life, liberty, and property. Any other action is usurpation and oppression. Alabama State Constitution. I did that one night, and somebody in the audience raised their hand and corrected that. I made an error in how I said it. I just now put the word action in, and it was another word. I still need to go back and get corrected. Anyway, that tells us what the purpose of government is. So when the Bill of Rights was created, it was a protection. It was going to protect us. It was a declaration of prohibitions. The matter of whether or not to include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution was brought up before the Philadelphia Convention and was rejected unanimously. Huh? Yeah, the Founding Fathers. You know, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and those guys that were there. Where was Thomas Jefferson? France, thank you. I often ask, who wrote the Constitution? Who is the most popular one that high school students tell me wrote the Constitution? Jefferson. Jefferson was in France. So when these men got together and they were discussing the Bill of Rights, at one point in their vote, they unanimously agreed not to have a Bill of Rights. They said, we don't need one, because the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. It is an enumerated document, and it spells it out so clearly there could be no misconstruction, could there? Well, there was. We call this the Convention of States because that's what it was. 12 nations sent representatives to Philadelphia in 1787. George Washington declared, "The people retain everything they do not by express terms give up. Hence, a Bill of Rights is nugatory." That was his argument for not having a Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists were deeply concerned that it was not sufficient. And so the Anti-Federalists argued for a Bill of Rights. And we'll cover them more next Friday night. They're great people. Who's one of the leaders? Do you know any of the names of the famous Anti-Federalist? The one that's most outspoken? Hamilton was a pathetic nationalist. He was the one that started the Federalist Party. No, the one that's most famous that we hear most often is Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was an Anti-Federalist, and he was a great American statesman. And so when we see, that's probably Patrick Henry and the artist's conception of the Anti-Federalist on the cover there. I'll bring a box of those books next week. From the Federalist Papers, the truth is, after all the declamations we have heard, that the Constitution is itself, in every rational sense and to every useful purpose, a Bill of Rights. And so they argued we don't need another Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists declared the want of a Bill of Rights to accompany this proposed system is a solid objection to it. Language is so easy of explanation, and so difficult is it by words to convey exact ideas, that the party to be governed cannot be too explicit. The line cannot be drawn with too much precision and accuracy. The first consideration is the omission of a Bill of Rights, ascertaining and fundamentally establishing those unalienable and personal rights of men, without the full, free, and secure enjoyment of which there can be no liberty. Now see, this is the other viewpoint. This is the Anti-Federalist arguing for a more precise statement so there could be no misconstruction of the Constitution. The proposed Bill of Rights, the states were invited to send in suggestions. 189 suggestions. Many of them were similar, and so they were boiled down by James Madison into 17 proposals. Congress approved 12 of the 17, and the states ratified 10. So they became known as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. I was on a radio talk show in Texas. We were discussing this. Some lady called in, and she says, the Constitution was so poorly written that they began amending it immediately upon completion. Oh, really? Is that why we got the Bill of Rights? It was so poorly written, it was so inadequate? And I said, well, how am I going to deal with this? Would you please give me an example of how the Bill of Rights changed the Constitution? If it was so inadequate and poorly written, then how did the Bill of Rights change it? No comment. She didn't have a response. She said, well, it's just simply this. An amendment is a change. By the mere fact that they were amendments, that means it's changed. I invite you here in this room in Eagle Mountain today, give me one example of how the Bill of Rights changed any of the meaning of the original Constitution. Did it? Did it change any of the meaning? No. All it did was clarified. Most of us don't know that there's a preamble to the Bill of Rights. All we can think about is the preamble of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights preamble is left out of many of the bills, as they publish the Bill of Rights. We include it in ours because it's so important. There it is right there. This is the preamble. It's explaining why they added the Bill of Rights. The conventions of a number of states, having at the time of their adopting the Constitution, expressed the desire, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added. And as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution. Why did they write a Bill of Rights? In order to prevent keep them happy, in order to prevent misconstruction and abuse of the powers in the Constitution, further declaratory and restrictive clauses were added. That's why they wrote a Bill of Rights.